On January 3, 2026, the United States executed Operation Absolute Resolve, capturing Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro in a dramatic military raid and rendering him to New York to face criminal charges. This represents a watershed moment in hemispheric geopolitics, with profound implications for Venezuela's authoritarian allies and significant benefits for others. The following analysis examines the consequences for each major stakeholder and identifies the strategic winners from this realignment. Cuba faces the most acute threat among Venezuela's allies. The island's economy relies precariously on subsidized Venezuelan oil, which has been Cuba's primary lifeline since the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. Currently, Cuba receives approximately 27,000 to 30,000 barrels per day from Venezuela, a dramatic decline from the 100,000 barrels per day at the relationship's peak under Hugo Chavez. Even at current depressed levels, Venezuelan oil accounts for roughly 40% of Cuba's total oil import requirements. The consequences of losing even this reduced supply would be catastrophic. Cuba's economy has already contracted by 15% since 2018, with inflation approaching 450% and the Cuban peso collapsing on the black market to 450 per dollar from 30 in 2020. Approximately 90% of Cubans now live in extreme poverty, with 70% missing at least one meal daily. State employees earn only a few dollars monthly, making economic survival truly unsustainable. A complete severing of Venezuelan oil would trigger an immediate energy crisis comparable to the special period of the 1990s, forcing widespread blackouts and further reducing Cuba's already minimal industrial capacity. Compounding this vulnerability, Cuba cannot easily replace Venezuelan oil. While Cuba receives some support from Russia and China, this pales against Venezuela's historical contribution. China is itself pursuing debt restructuring rather than new lending. Trump administration officials, particularly Secretary of State Marco Rubio, have signaled that collapsing Venezuelan oil supply to Cuba is precisely the intended strategy. Trump stated on January 5, 2026, "Cuba seems poised to collapse. I am unsure if they can endure, but Cuba currently has no revenue. Their entire income stream was reliant on Venezuela, particularly its oil." China emerges as perhaps the second largest loser in this geopolitical shift. Beijing has extended approximately $12 to $23 billion in outstanding debt to Venezuela as part of its oil-backed loan program, the largest single-country commodity-backed position in China's global portfolio. The original Chinese financing extended since 2007 totaled approximately $60 billion across Latin America. Venezuela's total external debt now exceeds $150 to $170 billion, with over $60 billion in defaulted bonds. China's debt recovery prospects have deteriorated sharply. Venezuela was already in de facto default before Maduro's capture, unable to ship sufficient oil to service loans at agreed schedules. With a potential pro-U.S. government in Caracas, China faces several compounding problems. First, debt restructuring losses, as any new Venezuelan government deprioritizes Beijing's claims. Secondly, asset restrictions, as a U.S.-backed regime may exclude Chinese oil companies from operations while opening doors to American firms. And third, loss of strategic partnership, as Venezuela shifts from the anti-U.S. bloc to U.S. alignment. Beyond financial losses, China loses considerable geopolitical influence. Venezuela was central to Beijing's Latin American strategy, providing a foothold for challenging U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The Maduro government maintained close security ties with China and accepted Chinese surveillance and monitoring infrastructure. A pro-U.S. Venezuela represents a strategic setback for Beijing's efforts to position itself as a counterweight to Washington in Latin America. Notably, Maduro met with China's special representative for Latin American affairs just hours before the U.S. operation, emphasizing their relationship as the perfect union. This symbolic moment captures the depth of Beijing's miscalculation regarding Maduro's vulnerability. China failed to hedge adequately against regime change, despite warning signs from 2021 onward. Russia's losses from Maduro's removal are more nuanced. Strategically, Venezuela represented one of Moscow's few remaining footholds in the Western Hemisphere, a platform for projecting power against U.S. dominance and conducting operations that bypassed Western sanctions. Russia's Wagner Group deployed to Venezuela in 2019 and 2024 to ensure regime survival. Russian intelligence assets operated extensively in the country. Economically, however, Russia's exposure is more limited than China's. Russia does not maintain significant lending positions comparable to Beijing. Instead, Russia benefits from oil joint ventures operated through Rosneft, with the Bokharan and Perija oil fields estimated to generate approximately 16,600 barrels per day. These operations are worth roughly $5 billion in equity value. A U.S.-aligned government is likely to restrict or terminate these joint ventures, particularly given Trump's stated commitment to excluding non-hemispheric competitors from controlling strategically vital assets in the Western Hemisphere. Russia also loses access to Venezuelan oil as a sanctions evasion mechanism and as a participant in OPEC Plus coordination. The recent 15-year extension of Russian joint ventures approved in November 2025 now appears invalidated by the geopolitical shift. However, Russia's immediate economic pain is moderated compared to China because Moscow carries no significant commodity-backed debt and lower trade volumes with Venezuela. Politically, however, the symbolic loss is acute. The removal of one of Moscow's closest allies in the region, executed without Russia being able to mount effective military response, signals weakness, particularly given Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine. Analysts note that Russia is unlikely to risk incurring additional sanctions, and China is not inclined to face further tariffs for defending Maduro.